So thank you to all of our speakers today. And we've now got the opportunity to ask questions of all of your speakers and have a bit of a discussion about what we've heard today. So if you've got any questions, please type them into the question box. We'd be really keen to answer anything you want to know about. But while you type your questions in, perhaps I'll start with a first question. And I'm interested actually in what all of our speakers have got to say about this. We've heard from all of you about a range of different large data collections / registries or data warehouses, whatever we want to talk about them, that are bringing together data from different sources. And one of the issues that all of you have is data standardization, trying to get data in a way that everybody's able to analyze and easily use. Which brings us to the question of sort of standard data models. And I wonder whether any of you have thought about using standard data models. I know there are a number of them out there, things like OMOP, which might make the data much easier for a wide range of people to use and access. Jane, you're nodding. Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so we did look at the OMAP model, and we have mapped our data to it to a certain extent. I think it's great for having a standardized way of structuring the data that's consistent. However, there always is going to be inconsistencies in terms of one lab will have different types of tests to a different lab depending on what machines they have access to, and they'll have them recorded as a different name. So we have different labs at Westmead and Randwick. So looking at who's had an MPA test is I think there's 2 tests at Westmead and there's 3 tests at Randwick. They're all different names. So even that, having the OMAP doesn't solve that issue, unfortunately. So it's it's going through the work of trying to understand what different tests mean and different results mean is the difficult part. I think that it does. Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't matter about OMAP and what they've done. You still have to go through the work.
Charmaine, have you put any thought towards standard data models?
Oh, yes. So when we first started our project, we did the same approach as Jane. So we did look into all the data models, but then we quickly realized that as the data came out that mapping it to a data model isn't going to help. It will help in the future for going across sites and standard data flow and analysis. But just to even understand the data, like for a lab test, for instance, for 2 local health districts, 9 facilities, even the understanding of that took huge effort. So now that we know that, we could map it to a data model, but you kind of have to go through that whole process in order to do that.
So is there a world in the future, 10 years away, that this is more feasible?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. All the work that Jane described and Jennifer's described with mapping the EMR to the registry, I think this is all the foundation, laying the foundation for making this work feasible.
Jen, do you have anything to add to the standard data models conversation?
Oh, yes. I can't say I've heard the term standard data model before. The other girls are going to be horrified. I haven't heard of OMOP. But certainly what we've been using, there are some core outcome sets and definitions that exist in perioperative medicine, and we are certainly working with those.
Okay. Dorota, do you have any questions you wanted to ask?
Well, I would probably just like to, I have one question to Jennifer, and this is to follow on about the waiver of consent and other versions with consent.
Yes.
In my personal opinion, and in some experiences from being involved in several studies, having waiver of consent, it actually helps you having an unbiased population, whereas if people have to consent, and I would imagine in anesthetic studies that would be affecting the outcomes quite considerably. Do you have any comments on the differences in data collected if you have waiver of consent and not, and perhaps few words of wisdom of how to navigate while you're applying for ethics at different sites. And then we'll move back to the main topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I wasn't really sure if the waiver of consent would get through or not, but I did use the framework that I outlined there on that slide. And in fact, there weren't even any queries from the ethics office about the waiver of consent. It wasn't raised. To date, probably at least half the sites have had their SSAs approved, and it still hasn't been raised yet. I imagine it will be raised certainly by the private system, who are governed by separate privacy legislation to the states. I think it's a big, it would just simply not be feasible in clinical practice for anaesthetists on the day of surgery to gain consent in an anaesthetic bay or an operating theatre for patients to be included in a registry. We operate, I guess, a bit like an emergency department. It's a high turnover environment where, you know, every minute is crucial in the operating theatre, and to add an extra 5 minutes, for example, to every single case of the day would mean that one less operation could be done every day of the week.
I might just throw in an advertisement here that people may not be aware of. The use of the health department, so government agency, health department population level data sets and linked data used to be excluded from the NMA, and about 2 weeks ago, most of the states involved have signed MOUs to agree to allow linked data to be included in the NMA. So that might also help in the future with people reducing the number of ethics committees that you have to go through for those sorts of applications. So worth having a look into.
Felicity, does that?
Yeah.
Could I ask you, does that mean if we're applying for data from AIHW that we now wouldn't need to do the separate ethics approval with each state?
No, so there's a couple of exceptions. So the Commonwealth is not part of the NMA. The NMA is just a thing amongst state and territory health departments. So no, you still would have to go to the AHW and one other ethics committee from a state, so it would reduce it. There's also WA and Northern Territory have not signed up to the MOU at the moment. It may be possible that WA does in the future. I think it's unlikely that Northern Territory will, because of a lot of the research that goes through Northern Territory is also people are analysing on the basis of Aboriginality, so they have to go to their specialist committees anyway. But it certainly should reduce the number of committees that you need to go to, but probably not to one. So in many cases, it might be two.
So could I just go back to another question, starting really using Jennifer's talk as an example? You showed very, very nicely the fact that if you try to look at the ICD codes of post-operative complications, and if you look at the clinical notes, the pictures are quite different. Which basically your sources and how you deal with it is very important. And yet then we're talking about using the electronic medical records to get the information and snapshots, which means that there's a question of validity of the data that is obtained from the medical records. And Charmaine illustrated very well that it's a very complex issue. And if there is one picture we can take from the first presentation is the fact that it's a very, very complex and lengthy procedure. And you've described in your talk that the I think agreement or reliability wasn't great. Would you be able to comment on that more and sort of quantify it further?
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed Charmaine's talk. It was so useful, and I wonder if there's a role for, I'm thinking that I guess our experience was that the administrative data should not be used in isolation. So they might be added into a project like what Charmaine is doing. But when you talk about extracting data from the medical record, to me, I imagine that that is clinical data, not administrative data. And in fact, as clinicians, we can't even see the ICD-10 codes in the record. They're stored in my understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding is that they're stored in a completely different information system that clinicians don't even have access to normally. So I think maybe they could augment clinical data.
I think they normally are only coded after the episode is separated and by clinical coders. Yes, and right. There's lots of studies and sort of showing what that happens and how, and we know that we are all fallible on various occasions, and sometimes coders have problems if they see diagnosis question mark, whether you code it or not, and variety of other issues. But Charmaine, you talked about the data extraction and in acute coronary care, and now we understand how difficult a process that is. And at some point you did mention that the agreement wasn't great either. Would you be able to speak more about it and comment of how good the agreement was? If you look at the gold standard data set, or what ways and how you've evaluated that agreement, because I think this is very crucial, that if we are using extractions from the EMRs, we need to know that we're measuring what we intend to measure, at least with high specificity.
Yes, so this is exactly why we did the validation study, and it was a bit of an iterative process. So firstly, it was about how do we even identify, it would be easy to just validate the ones that are coded, but we wanted to do the potentially missed population. So how many of those records were available, how many of them had sufficient clinical data to review the record. So obtaining all the relevant clinical information. So we had ECGs, pathology tests, angiogram reports stored in a separate system, the discharge summary, first medical note. So actually in the EMR, the medical note, where there's no definition for how a medical note is defined. So we created a rule which was like, if the author of a note was a clinician mapped to another data table that had this person's name as a clinician, then that would be the clinical note. So I guess that's kind of the process of doing the validation study. We did it for a STEMI population, which is pretty well defined, and so we did see 90% agreement with the ICD-10 code, and so now I guess in theory we could use the ICD-10 code as the gold standard diagnosis for this particular cohort. But then because we had to select, I guess, a study population to do the validation, in order to find potentially missed codes, we define the population as those having an elevated troponin level. So we already had to filter it down in order to maximize our chance of finding a miscoded STEMI. So it's not like we could develop an algorithm for every ED presentation. We could actually only really develop something for patients who present to ED with a certain level of troponin measurements. We also did the validation study in NSTEMI, and that was also the sensitivity was much less. It was about 60–70%, and that just shows the heterogeneity of the coding, the condition, and the coding itself. So yeah, it's a lengthy process, but I think revealing.
Yeah. Oh, very much so, but it would almost, it feels to me that whatever condition and whatever situation you're trying to investigate, a validation study must be added to the study, because this is the only way we can see how well are we measuring and whether the results are applicable to what we're trying to evaluate.
Yeah, and it also reveals, I guess, whether the data is available whether the data is even available in the electronic medical record to make those decisions. Yes. So really we're limited by what's being captured, because it's not being captured for research purposes and doing validation studies. So, you know, for instance, we see when it's almost like a data completion audit before we did the validation study. I mean, trying to find everyone who has ECGs, you would assume that everyone has an ECG, but then sometimes people don't have an ECG, and they don't have certain blood tests, or the first medical note is after the catheterization. So there's no documentation until after the intervention. So you see all these types of things when you're trying to do a validation study.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming in. One of them, which is probably related to that conversation we've just had, is can the panel please comment on their experience with dealing with data integrity? I wonder whether Jane or Jen have got some comments about that, maybe.
I guess, yeah, so it follows on from what Charmaine was saying, and looking at the completeness of data that needs to be done to begin with. So every single record that we pulled out, every single cell that we pulled out, we would model it and see, so for pathology results, what's the high and low values against the age groups and that kind of thing. So every single thing was checked to make sure that it was consistent, it was valid, it was within the right ranges, and it was complete. So one of the things that isn't in the EMR is problems. So that's when the doctor will write what the person's diagnosis was. And some clinicians don't know that exists, some do. So in one oncology department, they write what cancer type they have in the problems, whereas in the other oncology department, they don't use that field. So it means that we have to look at a different way of calculating the picnic rule for that, now that they don't have that in there.
I might add to Jane's comment there. So Jane mostly talked about the data integrity at the end when all the data is extracted and we can actually look at the information, the clinical information. But there's a whole data integrity validation piece that happens within the database extraction and linkage process itself. So there's quite a detailed process for identifying the fields, extracting the right data, linking it properly, and turning it into something that into the process that Jane described, where you can actually look at the quality of the data item itself.
Excellent. Okay, we've got another one. Can we use coding software to analyze the unstructured EMR data? Charmaine's shaking her head.
Coding as in ICD-10 coding software, or just coding software, like data, like, okay.
Assume one and the other and answer both.
Yes.
Jane?
So in coding software, we use Python and R. So in terms of that, that's how we use it. So yes, that's exactly how you would code unstructured data. And we use regular expressions at the moment to kind of categorize people into different categories. So for sepsis, looking at people who have written sepsis in the notes. And we used R to do that.
Yeah, and I guess one of the caveats with using, so yeah, and we use the same approach as Jane, using regular expressions in R or Python. So that's mostly text-based mining approaches. But one of the problems is that there's all this variation. So there's no in medical notes. So there's no standard dictionary of documenting all these perturbations of, for instance, how chest pain is measured, or that and that sort of thing. So we kind of have to develop the dictionaries as we go. So there's nothing off the shelf in coding in R or Python that is perfectly tailored for our use case at the moment. So it's still evolving.
And while we're on the more technical questions, for Jen, how did you explain the intra-observer variation observed with post-op complications between anaesthetists?
Yes, that's a very good question. That was certainly a surprise finding. I think to me it really highlighted the importance of having trained research staff who assess outcomes as one of their main roles or as their primary role. So who become familiar with definitions, and where that's something they do all day, every day, as in the trained assessors as part of the National Surgical Quality Improvement Program in America that's now being run as a pilot in New South Wales. So we had 8 anaesthetists, 4 consultants and 4 registrars. And people were essentially doing this in their spare time. They were doing it in an hour off, or or staying back a couple of hours on a weekend. They were probably tired. They probably had little motivation, if you like. This is an extra task in addition to their job. They may or may not have been paying attention, or I guess just they may have just missed something. They may have been paying complete attention all of the time and just missed something, because we're all fallible. So it was certainly a surprise finding.
Dorota, do you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
I think probably for Jane, because you described a marvelous system that can help patient care analyze what is happening in hospital. But if you look at some, and I'm still stuck in my mind on this idea of validation and seeing, can we get this information elsewhere? And if we do, how do they compare? You had the study of antiemetic, and I have been involved, for example, in anesthetic studies where you can design a research study without all the effort that you have described to us to provide answers to similar questions. Are you familiar, or have your center conducted study along your system and see how they compare, or would you be able to comment on that?
So the only thing I can comment on that is that from this work, the department is petitioning to have a national clinical registry for kids in this area. And so they wanted to do the same format in using an electronic method and hiring data engineers to build that across the country. So they haven't looked at the other ways of doing it. So I work very closely with them. So while I do a lot of the data stuff, they inform those kind of questions.
Okay. And if other centers, for example, wanted to embark on a similar system that is been implemented in your hospital, what advice would you have for them?
Make sure you have executive support, because it's a long-term project and you need specialist skills, and you need those specialist skills on the long term, not just for a month and then they get pulled off. So that's probably part of the problem. We could have built the data warehouse by now, but other things keep coming up that people get pulled off and on for. So that's quite frustrating. Having clinical leads to help. So in the anesthesia department, it's quite interesting that when we presented with them, we've got a couple of people that are really on board, that they approached me to see what we could do, and they've done their own Stanford AI courses and things like that. So they're really gung-ho about this kind of thing. And then we presented to them, and one of the guys mentioned about this isn't, randomized clinical trial. We're not doing it in the appropriate way. So kind of what's the point of having these clinical trials using data that's collected from the medical record? So that, and the clinical lead was able to talk as a peer and say what his reasons for doing this is. It's saving money, we can get so much data from this, and this is kind of the way forward, how we're going to actually change clinical practice. So I think having that a strong clinical lead is really, really important to convince the colleagues in the department that this is the way forward, and then also obviously having the right skill set of people and the right team leader, managing that team that understands what's required, because it's quite complex and it's not standard practice of what people are used to. So you need that understanding to support the staff.
Because it does seem to me like it's a marvelous tool in all various areas in hospital, and we all should be using it.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, I think you have one at the Alfred for 5 years.
Right. Okay.
I wonder
FYI.
whether Charmaine or Jennifer want to finish up by giving their sort of top tips for establishing a registry or data warehouse, for example. What are the take-home messages you would give to people in the audience who might be thinking about doing this themselves?
Virtual registry, that is.
Yeah.
Yep. I think Jane really highlighted them in her response just then. So executive support, clinical champions and leadership, and really the right analytics personnel who aren't going to leave in 1 month, or you need that personnel to be there to help you set up your system. And really the same skills that set up a system for, say, perioperative surgery or anesthesia or interventional cardiac care, they're all the same. It's the analytic skill set, even though it's quite broad, is the same, can be used for all these different clinical use cases. So it's really being able to use that skill set wisely for all these different applications. So that's resourcing.
Yeah.
Jen, what about the setting up registries? What's your...
Sure. I did want to acknowledge when you asked earlier about the about my inter-rater reliability. One other thing is it may have been our definitions. It's quite possible that the definitions weren't easy to interpret. So I didn't want to say that it was all human error. There may have been other factors as well. In terms of my tips, certainly collaborating with like-minded people across all different disciplines has been very important for us. On our coding study, we had, I think, 8 anaesthetists, plus three of our IT team who helped us develop our perioperative registry, plus our senior hospital coder, plus our head of department. So it was really great to work with such a broad group of people, and everybody could bring their expertise to the table. I think certainly registries, I've learned a lot. Most things I've learned about registries I've learned from my ACTA conferences actually, and meetings and listening to other groups. So I think we're certainly the new kid on the block there. I have been, I guess, talking a lot to other people that are further down the track than us. And another tip that I was given recently in terms of proving the value of my own registry is that there's so much work to be done to get everybody on board to set things up, that it is important to demonstrate to our constituents, if you like, to our sites, some quick early wins. So I'm trying to, so our risk prediction model hopefully will be one, because that will be something that that clinicians will be able to use in their daily work. That national study was planned for July this year. It's unfortunately been interrupted by coronavirus. So we'll have to delay it. But I'm certainly starting to think already about some registry randomised controlled trials. Something nice and simple that involves routine care or a comparative effectiveness trial that we could get up and running quite early to show people the benefits of registry participation.
Okay. Dorothy, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Well, I think it was a marvelous session. I really would like Jane's system to be introduced in our hospital, and we'll see what will happen. Thank you to all the speakers, and we'll continue our conversations over time. And over to you, Felicity. There was one question. Someone has asked which states did not agree to NAM for linkage. And
I thought I'd already said that. It's Western Australia and Northern Territory. Tasmania is also not part of the NMA at all, but they do have a sort of reciprocal arrangement outside of the NMA. So it's really WA and Northern Territory at the moment.